fellow Trek Chatters, I'm Pit Trekkie, and welcome to another episode of Pittsburgh's Trek Chat. So for today's episode, I am going to be completing my review of Star Trek Phase 2, A History Through Pictures. Part 1 seemed to be very, I guess you could say, successful. A lot of people seem to really like it and enjoy it and commented. I'm very happy, and thank you very much for all of you who had watched and commented. So the first episode talked basically about just some basic stuff, about the Enterprise refit for Phase 2, the bridge refit, and the new engineering. So now what we're going to focus on in today's episode is basically the rest of the Enterprise. Certain areas such as the corridor, the transporter room, Kirk's quarters / the crew quarters, and then we're going to focus on other parts of the beginning process of the show, including pictures from In Thy Image, which was focused basically on Admiral Nagora's office, the travel pod, the orbital office, and then I'm going to show some other miscellaneous pictures, such as with some of the Phase 2 scripts, uniforms, and test screenshots that many of you have seen before, but it's always fun to include in here anyway. Can't have a Phase 2 history without some of those screenshots of test appearances. So, and then after that we'll have a final discussion, and then we will go on from there. So sit back and enjoy part 2 of Star Trek Phase 2, A History in Pictures. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of Star Trek Phase 2, A History in Pictures. It was a lot of fun getting these last 2 episodes together, so I really hope that all of you enjoyed it and found some pictures that maybe you had never seen before. That's always the fun part. So before we wrap up this video, basically what I want to talk a little bit about is the legacy that Star Trek Phase 2 has left. And there are several different areas. So basically, first of all of the sets that were built for Star Trek Phase 2 ended up being remodeled, essentially, for Star Trek the Motion Picture. So if you want to say a little bit of Phase 2 still exists, watch it in Star Trek the Motion Picture, definitely. But you can also see the influence in Star Trek 2, Star Trek 3, and Star Trek 4 with the Enterprise A. All the sets still look pretty much the same. So, and all of those sets were then refurbished to be the Enterprise D sets in the Next Generation. And then after Next Generation ended, they were fixed up again and repurposed to be the sets for Voyager. Those sets stood until May of 2001, when the sets for Voyager were destroyed and new sets were built for Star Trek Enterprise. So there was a lot of legacy that those sets had, going all the way back. Also, this is a very basic one, the whole Ilia-Decker relationship where they met on Delta 4 when Decker was stationed on the home planet. Obviously, that got recycled into the Next Generation with Riker and Troy. The only difference is that Riker was assigned to Beta Z. What's really nice is we got to see the final culmination of that relationship with them getting married eventually and having children. Also, there were 2 scripts that were used from Star Trek Phase 2 in the Next Generation. The Child, but instead of Ilia getting pregnant, we had Counselor Troy get pregnant, and then Devil's Due, which was, the story was similar, but a lot different. I can't imagine that episode would have been any better than what we got from the one in the Next Generation. Because, come on, Ardra and that music that went along with her, I mean, spot on. That was a wonderful character. I guarantee you it wouldn't have been the same in the Phase 2 version. Alright? Also, it helped to relaunch, it was supposed to relaunch the Star Trek franchise. Alright? So, basically what it did was it was supposed to bring Star Trek back from the dead. Okay? But even though it didn't work in that regard, it still led to the creation of course, Star Trek the Motion Picture. So, and then from that we had the subsequent movies, and then the Next Generation, and we had the golden era of Star Trek from 1987 until 2001. Or 2005, I'm sorry, and then we have the current Star Trek now that's out. So Star Trek's still up and going. In 1997, there actually was a book written about this series called Star Trek Phase 2, The Lost Series, and it was written by Star Trek superfans Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens. If you haven't read that book, please go and get it at your local library, order it on Amazon. It's an excellent history of the series. It's got a lot of wonderful pictures, all of them, many of whom which were on in this episode, the last 2 episodes, but there's also a lot of detail and history written about what happened. So definitely check that out. And of course, let's back up 2 years to 1995. So UPN was launched on January 16th, 1995, and the cornerstone of that new network was Star Trek Voyager, just like it was supposed to be in 1978 with Star Trek Phase 2 and the Paramount Television service. So Star Trek history kind of repeated itself, which is kind of fun. Alright? So those are basically the areas where I feel that Star Trek Phase 2 has left a legacy. Can you imagine what the Star Trek franchise would be like now if Star Trek Phase 2 had been made? Who knows if we would have had any subsequent movies? Who knows if the Next Generation would have ended up happening, or what with Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and what we have now. A lot of that may not have even existed. So it's an interesting thought to kind of be like a what if, like an alternate reality would be with that version of Star Trek. But I'm still very happy that we got what we got, and that we have this little nugget of Star Trek history from the late 1970s. So that's it for this episode. If you liked the episode, please feel free to comment down below. I'd love to read your comments, and I will get back to you on them. You can watch previous episodes of Pittsburgh's Trek Chat. You can go onto youtube.com, just type Pittsburgh's Trek Chat into the search engine. It'll take you directly to my channel. You can follow the show on Facebook, facebook.com/Pittsburgh's Trek Chat. You can also follow the show on X at PGH Trek Chat. Looking forward to the next episode. Until then, may yins live long and prosper.